it's a long, 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 schlong, 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 long, 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 clong, clong, clong. There's a long black train and it's coming down the line. There's a long black train and it's coming down the line. Thanks, Carl. And I know what I'ma need is something to find. There's a long black train and it's going down the line. And I know what I'm here to come to find. Copy message link, post MCCM1. How's everyone doing? I see you lurking in my cat room. I haven't officially started yet. How y'all doing? I got 7 minutes to talk to y'all. How you doing? How you feeling? How your mama? How your papa? How your grandpapa? How your granny? Cause I wanna make it. Maybe no, baby. Wrong represent things. If you did no wrong, I could be the good for you, baby. You already know. Cause I wanna make it. You know that I'm really. As I feel as you feel, when she's saying so, that she wanna be feeling it, all you can't open. So now she feeling she out there getting over. While I so free. And how she feeling up and on me. I'm trying to know where she trying to go. And how she feels, how she finna fly, ever since the same thing. I can put the gun for you. You already know, cause I wanna make it. I'm a really long baby. Hello.
7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I can spare.
I'm not sure I know what the reference of that is.
Oh, it's Albert Wesker from Resident Evil.
The movies or the game?
The game.
Okay. Oh shit. I haven't properly been able to play through all the games. Too much money. I haven't emulated them yet either.
Yeah.
Today's content is going to be really weird for those who did not watch the podcast last night. Only 2 hours and 33 minutes. The majority of most of it is post first hour, but today, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of the audience, I bring and prepare to you, as was said and announced at the end, as we were given our flowers on how we were ending the podcast last night, that this is the titular video itself. This is where InPraiseOfShadows lost his goddamn mind and said, I'm going to cancel Wendigo. This is the man himself in his environment in a piece of content which was supposedly some of his best. We're going to see how he got to where he got and how he came to the position that horror is love and hate was an acceptable option versus making more things that he says is love. I expect to be fully disappointed and feel as though we have learned nothing. But that remains to be seen.
I am a newborn babe when it comes to this conversation. I see nothing. I know nothing. I did not even get up this morning.
Okay.
So, for those unaware, could we get a brief rundown on what's going on?
I just gave you the brief rundown. What do you mean?
Oh, that was it.
That was it. If you want to know more, watch the podcast from last night. Mm-hmm. 3 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. 3 minutes till showtime. I'm so happy to be in my house.
It's only for 3 minutes. It's 3 minutes of playtime.
Ironically enough, it was colder in my wife's room. This goddamn wind machine ain't doing shit! I gotta get there. I need to get the love crust out of my eyes.
I need to get something to eat later. I am.
Going to deafen, and then I'm going to return, ladies and gentlemen. I leave you with the dulcet sounds of my music. I have returned. And now that the timer has elapsed, let us begin, chat.
Hills Have Eyes is a movie that nobody wanted to make. It was a marriage of convenience, built on compromises that left everyone somewhat unsatisfied. A film that is today revered as a classic that in its time was made for little more than a cash grab. They came out of a situation that nobody involved saw coming or really wanted to find themselves in. For reasons that we will get into later, Wes Craven was in deep financial straits. It had been 4 years since his first and most recent film, The Last House on the Left, was unleashed onto the American drive-ins, and he was out of cash and desperate to get another project off the ground. But he had been struggling for years to make anything happen, and he didn't want to make another horror film, but as he would go on to say, it soon became clear that I wasn't going to do anything else unless it was scary. Producer Peter Locke approached him with about $500,000, which today would be close to about $2.5 million, and said that he wanted to hire him to make another scary movie. Apprehensive to this, Craven said that he would do it if it could be a dark fairy tale adaptation of Hansel and Gretel, to which Locke said no, and he made it clear that he was seeking him out specifically to make another grindhouse hit like The Last House on the Left had been. And seeing as he had no other real options, he was more or less forced into saying yes if he wanted to continue to have a career within the industry. Forced into making this movie that he had no real interest in. This is evident in the first
1 second, chat. Sorry about that, chat. Personal things. Let me get
No.
Let me get that off the screen. Let's continue.
First draft of the script for the film that was also rejected by Peter Locke. It begins with a Texas Chainsaw-esque opening crawl that reads, in 1973, following the release of The Last House on the Left, the writer-director of that film was committed for psychiatric observation. He was treated extensively with drugs, group therapies, electroshock programs, and a final lobotomy. Despite these efforts at reform, Craven killed his nurse, Mara Heffy, and escaped to the Mojave Desert. At the end of 1,000 days of meditation, he was taken up by a jet black saucer and trained in secondary media infiltration and parametaphysical survival on the planet Jupiter. Upon his graduation, he was returned to the planet Earth at Exeter. This film is his first since his return, and is respectfully dedicated to the memory of Mara Heffy. I love this paragraph of text, and it demonstrates right here in 1977 the same oddball satirical wit that he would use in building Scream with Kevin Williamson, and shows that even from the very beginning this mindset was a key part of the gears of his artistic inclinations. This first version of the film, which at the time was being called Blood Relations: The Sun Wars, is fairly different from what The Hills Have Eyes ended up becoming. One such difference was the setting itself, as Craven imagined the family going on vacation in New Jersey and getting torn apart by rural New Jersey rednecks, which I find very funny for a New Yorker to have written. But funny enough, Peter Locke was dating Liz Torres, who you may know as Miss Patty on Gilmore Girls, and she had a contracted permanent show in Vegas at the time, and he didn't want to travel, so we told them to film the movie in the desert outside the city. But before we really get into all of this, we should say what The Hills Have Eyes is about, for those who are watching this who have never seen any of its 4 iterations. It tells the story of the Carters, a typical pretty and wealthy American family, who are in the midst of taking their summer vacation across the country to Los Angeles. And when we first meet them, they are in the middle of a desolate wasteland of Nevada, where they stop for the afternoon because of car trouble and are attacked by a family of hill people led by Papa Jupiter, who live up in the dry Nevada mountains. Jupiter and his family live off of the land, and survive by eating what they kill or find, including those who have crossed into their territory. And a war breaks out between the two clans, demonstrating the inherent animalistic instincts to survive in the face of opposition that we all have beneath our skin. That immediacy of violence, when what we perceive as ours is threatened. There are some things present in this original script that I think could have possibly made Hills a more thematically coherent film, or at least a more enjoyable or stylish one. The very first scene begins with the words, "Harbor shot of Manhattan," horribly polluted air half-veiling the steel and concrete teeth of the Rock Island. A shot of the Brooklyn Bridge jammed with stalled traffic. Slow zoom in to a station wagon towing a large camper trailer. A radio announcer is talking about the record heat index for the day in the city, and how a violent shootout in Brooklyn Heights has caused a massive traffic jam. It is a similar metropolitan end-of-days gloom opening that Frank Miller would use a decade later in The Dark Knight Returns, and I feel is a good way to introduce these characters. Their environment contrasts so harshly with everything else in the narrative, but also has its own undertones of survival of a different sense. And if filmed in the right way, could have been at the back of our minds throughout the rest of the film, the family trading one hell for another. Similar to the novel Burnt Offerings, which starts in a nightmare version of New York for the first few chapters before transitioning into the relaxed yet ominous countryside for the rest of the tale, where sinister doings linger in the shadows. The contrasting of locations makes the novel as a result feel less one-note while also narratively cohesive, and that could have been done here too. The script has a feeling of opulence and reverence for the setting, which as filmmakers they couldn't quite pull off either. This tone for the desert and the respect for its lethality is not fully present in the final film as much as you get a feeling for it in Craven's prose. It is the description of a landscape so remote that even God cannot protect them where they are going. True nature unaffected by man in its ruthlessness and uncaring ambivalence.
Okay, so here's a question, InPraiseOfShadows. As you give us this long, drab, boring-ass intro into everything you're talking about, where did the love come in? Where did the love go? Where has it gone, InPraiseOfShadows? Where could it be?
Not here.
Where did the Simpson comments go? Also, very interesting you bring religion into it.
What is presented here is poetry. It would be impossible to really present true to form on screen, but nonetheless gives the script a distinct feeling that the family has entered a place of death long before they even know it, in a way that the film never really expresses. That there exists a trap that has been webbed specifically just for them. Exterior desert and badlands, noon. Fade up on extreme telescopic shot of the sun, a blood-red hole in the frying atmosphere. A hatch of spittle-hardened sand is thrown open with a startling rasp, and a sooty trapdoor spider clatters out and freezes, allowing the spores of the hot air to penetrate the moist sensors behind its unblinking eyes. It is a bit sad reading the script for this, because it presents a true, unhindered vision of a film that would not have been really possible for them to pull off, both because of financial reasons as well as experience. It is a more true-to-form version of The Hills Have Eyes, but one thing that can be appreciated here is that it is ambitious, even though it was a setting that was forced on them and was not chosen for a creative reason. For someone to run with that and openly embrace the idea that they want to take a crew out into the middle of a 120-degree desert for their first actual movie, at the very least shows an aspiration that should be admired. And by all accounts, even though it was a film that he didn't particularly want to work on, once on set he brought a level of professional focus for the film, and his role as a leader, and worked to make the best product that he and his team could put together. The Hills Have Eyes is a very American film. Every look of the characters in this movie both fits the world that they are trying to present of this 1970s upper-middle-class suburban family, while also at the same time being extremely memorable character design. But not only that, but their clothes are used to other them. They are distinguished, different from the people of the hills and those who live in the valley, who live off of the land. How people dress and present themselves says a lot about who they are as a person. And in film, clothing and costume design is a tool that can be used to build a commentary about a character, and should be utilized more often than it actually is, because instantly we understand based on appearances without even thinking about it. Clothes and how a person looks and how they are presented is a communicator that converses with the subconscious. Okay. It is a common theme that can be found all across Craven's filmography, and is something that he puts special attention to. Freddy Krueger having a dirty brown hat says as much about him as it does that Casey Becker has blonde hair and a white sweater.
Okay, but I could do the same thing myself. I decided to go to an actual fucking hair care salon and said, I want the Cisco blonde cut. Like that doesn't really mean much in the context of the things, InPraiseOfShadows, but I can see the point. If you can get to your point, they filmed in the desert. They made the best with what they had to do. Okay, get to your point.
The hill people, in reflection of that, are dressed in an almost stereotypical parody of how Native Americans are often presented in older westerns, mixed with...
But they're not Native American. They're supposed to be basically isolated cannibals. What part of isolated cannibals screamed Native American to you? What?
A caricature of the classic idea of the inbred redneck hillbilly, and further adds to the commentary that this family doesn't belong here. Just by the way that they look, you can tell that they do not fit in with this vast desert landscape.
Yeah, they're not wearing animal skulls and bones, and they also don't fuck like they're supposedly inbreds. Therefore, this family doesn't exist. Look at how alien they are. That's so 1970 Gap. What?
They are an economic invading force. What is both home and hardship to one...
The economic invading force of people traveling to the Badlands
is a curiosity to pose in front of and take pictures to a group of others from a wealthier background. On the most basic, surface, superficial level, this is a film about cannibals killing and eating a family who get lost on their summer vacation. And psychologically, most when they watch this will be on the side of the vacationing family, and wish for them to survive and make it out and get back home. And why is that? Because if you look at this from the perspective of the hill people, they are only defending what is theirs, this land that they call home.
Yeah, but they're also not being attacked. They're just murdering people who are literally just vacationing. Also, you said cannibalistic hill people are Native Americans, so we've already got to our first Chudism of the stream. We already got to the first Chudism. Let's start a list, boys. Let's start a list. Mutant, inbred, hill people equals Native Americans.
That's a wild take.
Mutant, inbred, hill people. Mhips are didn't do nothing. They're just protecting the land. Because when I protect what's mine, I always make sure to cut off the op's leg and then eat it like a hunk of turkey. Straight out like I was at Disneyland.
Don't step on my farm. They ain't do no harm. I'll be damned if I let some officer crush my rutabagas.
Nigga, what?
Wait. No, that doesn't. I'm sorry.
Oh my god. That's wild, bro. That's wild. That's wild, bro. Bro, that's so wild. That's so wild. That is so wild.
I take it to the bad kind of wild.
I mean, there's sometimes there's a bad kind of wild, good kind of wild. That's just wild. That was wild that you said that. That's so crazy. Anyways, I need to set the opacity. I need to set this opacity. Alright, let's continue.
Carter family would have never been killed if they had stayed in that monstrosity of industry that is New York, that their own kind created. It can stand in that way as a bit of an allegory as well. Of that.
The allegory is the invading whites should go back where they came from. I promise you that he's doing this completely ironically. He is not making a statement that can somehow be used to demonstrate how bigoted he is towards minorities. I promise. This is how the right wing thinks of the minorities. He's not at all doing the thing the roundabout way. Pish posh chat. Cherish the thought. Cherish the thought. Cherish the thought. There's no possible way that this is something he's doing on purpose. They would never. I was promised that the left wing are the good ones. If I can get this chrome, if I can get the opacity to be just right. Okay, that's about the best I can get the opacity to be for that. Maybe I can get it a little better. If I don't have the opacity, it's just gonna be in the way, and it's kind of hard to key this up like this, as you can clearly see here. So I just gotta work with the opacity, chat. I'm sorry if it obscures the video on the screen, but we have to work with it.
Fact that even though we are housed under the umbrella of America, we are many different countries comprising of many different people that do not get along or like each other. To say that the Hill people and the New Yorkers are of the same nation would only be true in the strictest definition, in that they happen to live within the same borders, but culturally, they couldn't be more different. The Hills Have Eyes is a clash of when you take two types of people who hold absolute contempt for one another, and then
they don't know nobody outside of themselves, because they eat anything they come across. They live in the desert. What do you mean, open contempt for two sides? Why are you showing political news while you say this diatribe? You couldn't possibly be making a comparison, are you? Nah, that's what chuds do, bro. I was promised that you're one of the good ones. Come on. Come on! Don't be silly.
then you proceed to call them both American and equals, who supposedly have the same opportunities at birth. The film is shot and edited in a way that would become uncharacteristic for later Craven works. The style that he would develop over his career is smooth, nice establishing framing with cameras that glide through scenes, cut in such a way that you don't particularly notice the edit or the filmmaking itself. He builds dreams that he lulls you into. But that isn't the case here. Frenetic camera movements clash with harsh cutting and a liberal use of handheld style, with angles that are often uncomfortably close to the actors, putting off at times an almost documentary-like feel, which would make sense considering that one of the primary inspirations for Craven here was Tobe Hooper's 1974 masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And some would even go so far to say that this is a ripoff of Chainsaw more than anything else. The two films even share the same production designer, so all of the bones in this movie are the exact same ones that were in the house in Hooper's work. The Hills Have Eyes lacks that tactile intensity that made that work important. As good as Craven was, he had an artistic inability to play things completely straight. There was always a slight wink at the camera, which doesn't work when trying to ape Chainsaw's style, which consists of unfettered madness, presented with such blinding clarity that it becomes difficult to look at. And this is why I think that Texas Chainsaw works and Hills Have Eyes at times doesn't. I believe it is also why he was best suited and worked most creatively free with his 4 Scream films, where he was able to make horror while also being stylized and critiquing the genre as an art form, while at the same time participating in it. It took his whole career to get there, but he finally found a franchise that suited his comedic and satirical eye. In my opinion, he isn't really suited for that raw, pure, animalistic, slaughterhouse-based horror that he was emulating from Hooper's film. At times, this work feels melodramatic and goofy, and that's not a bad thing, but definitely contrasts with the tone that they seem to be going for. Both do not easily exist in the same space.
Yes, because he was being forced to make this film, and he wanted to do something else entirely. Did you think that you were getting somewhere? You said some shit that we already know.
That being said, though, nobody has ever since 1974 been able to make something that felt this hot and dirty. Hooper didn't even recapture that feeling when he revisited Chainsaw a little over a decade later, although I would argue he wasn't really trying to recapture it. And any film since then trying to recreate that intensity only pales in comparison to the original. So it isn't really a complaint that can be lodged against The Hills Have Eyes. There can only be one Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A common theme between these films is that of meat, or the consumption of people. Economic domination requires the consumption of the flesh and lifeblood of another. The complete desolation and destruction of one group for the greed-based prosperity of yourself and others like you.
Message, 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 message.
Stripping away the flesh of anything resembling joy or humanity and eating it in the name of profit. Cannibalism as a theme both in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and The Hills Have Eyes is a subversion and commentary on how historically rural country Americans are constantly crushed under the turning wheels of industry and drained of everything that they have so that the goods that they produce can be purchased at a fraction of their value and shipped off to larger, wealthier areas, leaving those rural stretches of land as husks that never grow or prosper out of these conditions, only making by with what little they have. In these films, those seen as rural hicks are rising up and eating the flesh of their symbolic masters, consuming them just as they themselves have been consumed. It is no coincidence that the father and the patriarch of the family, who is wanting to keep things as they traditionally are, is a retired cop, a symbolic and historic symbol of oppression that upkeeps wealth disparities by protecting those that perpetrated wealth crimes against the poor. He has a large dog that he travels with, and the film ends with one of the rednecks being gored to death by a dog ripping open his neck. And not only that, but he is a wealthy cop. His kids go to nice universities that they broadcast on their clothes. They all present with style and can afford to take vacations across the country. They are representative of everything wrong in America, everything that keeps the hill people from being able to grow and be financially stable.
Yes, the people who are keeping the hill people living in the hills is rich yuppies from another state. They specifically, implicitly, when the children were born, were told, we fucking hate mutants. We hate Hicks, we hate inbreeding, we hate Alabama, we hate the Winn-Dixie flag, we hate Winn-Dixie, we hate Southeastern grocers, we hate all of them. And I am going to train you so that when we go on vacation on your, when will you be going to college? Days, that we will have you out there and we will express how much we hate them. Boo, boo, boo. Nigga, be for real.
What's that?
And I also do not think that it is a coincidence that their last name is Carter, and share that name with a family of famous American folk singers, who started the genre of popular country music as we know it today. A family whose origins were in poverty but ascended from that into wealth, by using the backbone of rural American aesthetics, values, and culture. And in a way that...
Or, just being good fucking musicians. Listen, guys, we have a concept of capitalism, dude. How dare you have talent? How dare you use your talent to rise out of the muck? Political activation is the most important thing. Not having a message to say, not having something to make, not having a point you want to get across through a piece of media. No. Your political aspirations. Your political aspirations and those modified beliefs and what you believe is, quote, the truth. Hashtag TM straight start to what matters most. Fuck all that other shit.
The film asks if these people are wrong for killing their invaders. Is it wrong to eat the people who have been eating you and your ancestors for decades and even centuries?
They weren't eating them. What do you mean by eat? They're yuppies on vacation. They didn't eat anything except the processed pork they got from the plant that they usually get from their local grocer. And the meat butcher, whose name is Harry. That is the 5th Eat the Rich allegory that he's made. It was literally 5 minutes. Well, actually, no, it was less than that. It was 2 minutes and 30 seconds between the first one. I don't understand. How did you do that? How did you find a way to be extremely gay?
I wouldn't say extremely gay, I'd say extremely political.
Lord have mercy.
consuming everything that you and your people have ever made without creating anything of substantial value themselves. The phrase isn't kill the rich, it isn't hang the rich, it's eat the rich, and was done that way with intention.
The intention of what? To tell every single person who's a starving artist in Oregon that you literally need to eat people? I mean, if you want to make yourself go crazy, not because of politics, but because of the fucking brain-eating dryons that are going to make you gibbering fucking... Like, they literally will make you gibbering retard cannibals. Be my guest! Well, we will record you, and you can become the next horror film. It came from the general election!
Father Jupiter and his family are filled with murderous rage, but why shouldn't they be? Do you see the surroundings that they are forced to put up with? At one point, he says to the father, Bob Carter, "Your dog made sport of my blood, you pig. I'm gonna kill your kids for that. You come out here and stick your life in my face, stick your fingers in my pie. That was a bad mistake. I thought you were smart and tough. You're stupid. You're nothing. I'm gonna watch your goddamn car rust out. Yes, I will. I'll see the wind blow your dried up seeds away. I'll eat the heart of your stinking memory. I'll eat the brains of your kids' kids." There is a tangible fury here, a pure, unadulterated need for blood, and through that, vengeance. Vengeance at their situation and the systems in place that have forced them into this. In a way, are they not justified for their actions? The Hill people...
What system forced them to live in the fucking hells? They made a choice to live in the hells. They could leave. They could try their risk to make it a civilization, try to socialize, and forget the past of what they did there. But no, they choose to live in the desert. They choose to live in the bumfuck desert. They sit there hating people who literally are just passing through. And so he decides to say, I'm gonna eat and shit your children's children. Yeah, that doesn't at all reek of vengeance that has lasting consequences, and also will echo what will happen eventually in the future of your fucking career. No. Listen. It's the themes. It's about the themes of what it means. The themes of revenge. I'm not at all making this based on my personal instincts of my political aspirations against others.
People can be representative of anything that you want them to be, really. They can be Native Americans, and the hills themselves can be allegorical of them being forced back onto reservations.
But they're not Native American. They're fucking cannibalistic mutant rednecks.
Be Black Americans that have for hundreds of years been forced to live within a dehumanizing system that has balances in place that assure that they can...
The dehumanizing system of black people living in America. There's a period of time which that would be true for about a good fair number would be 133 years. And then, after that 133 years, everything else was a tenuous brokerage of peace. And then after the clear point which was signed into law that no man will be discriminated against on those means, an example of you doing the same thing every other person who wants to play victim does. Which is saying, help me, I'm being oppressed. You literally can do whatever you want. I'm being oppressed. You didn't give me $10 million to live my life free. What would Uncle Jebediah say? What would Chieftain Motumbo do if he knew that you were mistreating his sixth removed kid that was impoverished by generational slavery? I didn't do nothing, and you didn't do nothing to have all that money, so I deserve it first.
Can be anyone who has been a victim of hundreds of years of horrifically violent, white, wealthy, educated progress. But the tragic and unfortunately thematic logical thing about the Hills Have Eyes is that this plot to rise up against them doesn't work. And that isn't Craven saying that it shouldn't work, but that the systems have been in place for so long and have so many people convinced that this is the natural way that things should be, that resistance inevitably ends in bloodshed and failure. That the horrors of the world dictate that no matter how much we fight against these things, they will continue to prevail, because those with money have an invested interest in keeping things the way that they are.
I mean, sometimes? Hey, Yor. Sometimes? Maybe? That doesn't mean all the fucking time. It's kind of dumb. I could make a lot of justifications to say, well, haha, yes, I'll always try to keep my power no matter what. But as someone who has the power of having an audience, in terms of like voicing in what audience I have, communication of my philosophies and my ideas and my beliefs, that doesn't really mean anything. It's not meaningful in any serious degree. And if you were consider it to be one, What the fuck do you mean by that? And what the fuck do you mean when you say those things? Okay? The last thing you literally just said, in this order, you said Native Americans are mutant inbred hill people because the mutant inbred hill people are Native Americans. You then said that the mutants can be representative of anyone, anything, and any comparative struggle that you could politically pull from. And unfortunately, you chose to then say they could be black people in slavery. So, you have two options here. Technically, you have three, depending on if you want to also include how Japanese or Asian-born Americans were felt when they were put into internment camps because of the fucking war started between us and Japan and the Axis powers. Mutant inbred hill people, the MIPS, are Native Americans. And the Native Americans didn't do nothing. They're just protecting what's theirs. The white man destroyed my people. So for that, I will take his daughter and I will break it down. Running bull style. Or, since they could be anyone and everything, hey yo man, my great granddaddy was owned by your great 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 grandmama. And for that, your great great grandmama had to bust it down, sexual style. She was gang raped by 55 slaves. We busted down, sexual style. There was 54 pieces on that train and your grandmama's grandmama's grandmama was riding caboose. Every slave had a hat, clack, 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 clack. And then after we took advantage of her, we took advantage of your other ancestor and your other ancestor, and now it's my turn to take advantage of you. And I saw that you have a wife and a daughter. Why don't you let me stay in my place for the weekend? And if you don't let me hit, I'm gonna call you a bigot and said that you called me the hard R on the internet. And then I'm gonna get you canceled. Well, then what are you gonna do, white boy? You male monster.
You milk monkey.
Hey, yo.
I can say it. I'm white. I went too far again, didn't I?
A little bit. And then, of course, you have your Asian Americans, or any person that perceives themselves as a minority to be a big victim. Whatever we feel is the ruling class, we deserve to have the right to take your shit, steal your shit, and kill you, and eat you. Metaphorically speaking. And literally. You then allegorate this with a very clear, definitive basis of the framework of what you believe this film means to you. Remember, you, Mr. Horror equals love. Capitalism bad. We eat people's potential for profit. Those invading uppity whites should go back to where they came from. 5 total eat the rich allegory justifications, back to back, followed by how dare people lift themselves out of poverty by having a talent and not being politically activated and constantly aggrandizing and agitating for social change. Maybe Wes Craven just wanted to make a film, and he was forced to make a film that had to be scary because of his former success with The Last House on the Left. But no. We can't even have the anatomy of the franchise. The anatomy of the franchise was clearly about that political shit that you just diatribed about. Surely Wes Craven had a time hollow, and he was looking into the future, and he knew that there'd be a MAGA chieftain sitting inside of the corporate chambers. And that when they were at the Senate, and they were in the chambers, that they would be there to say, hey, yo, brother, hey, American, oh, goddamn, sir, that's a really bad gash wound you got there. That's crazy. He foresaw January 6th, and he knew how it would be important to have a mutant, inbred, hobo, cannibal family to show those...
By the eye of Agamotto, They're raiding the Capitol Hill! I must put a stop to this by making this movie!
Yes, exactly, actually.
Sorry, continue.
But he knew all these things were going to happen, and that's what he was trying to make when he made this film. Is it maybe possible that you're high on crack, laced with fentanyl? That you started with some cocaine. Is it possible that you might be high? Because if you're not high, this is really bad for your character.
The family overtakes the Hill people and win, because they have the means to do so. They have more resources at their disposal.
The resources like guns.
They use their car, a machine representative of their wealth, to trap Papa Jupiter, and mortally wound him with his own weapon that resembles a tomahawk, before Bobby finishes him off with the symbol of police violence, and in turn a tool of
the symbol of police violence. The gun. As opposed to the baton.
upholding authority, his father's handgun. And ultimately, at the very end of it all, the Hill people only lose because of a class traitor in their midst, who helps her oppressors to keep the status quo, fearing what the uncertainties of change may bring.
Okay, so we've got gun equals symbol of police brutality. Car equals symbol of industry and homogeneity. And the whites only win because of class rivalry and betrayal. Because clearly, Bubba Jean was thinking only about herself and all that futuristic, fictional black dong she'd get in society. Because she knew that out there, she was just another cannibal who was destined to have a cross-eyed child. But in the city, she can be Sarah Dune, getting the Doonies beat off her by Richter, a black Satumbo man from Ghana who likes to go out in the icy polar vortex and order Subway. Talk about a new way of eating
you
fresh.
Like to harass people who order Subway. What's that? You got a meatball marinara sub? Disgusting.
Harvey.
All right, I'll shut up.
I'm not telling you to shut up. You're going a little bit too far.
Her brother in the back with the fangs of a rattlesnake, just as he has the upper hand. And as he falls to the ground, the symbol of inherited generational wealth, education, and power stands over his already dying body and stabs him repeatedly in the heart. Not to kill him, which at this point is already an inevitability, but to remind him of his place. To remind him where the power lies, to wound his spirit and kill his mind in a metaphorical sense, for daring to stand up to them. The cruelty is the point here. And in these...
The cruelty is the point. Despite dying to snake venom, being stabbed to death after attempting to kill other people is a clear sign of vengeance and cruelty, as opposed to the cruelty to try to take advantage of men and women in various forms of duress, maim, kill, excoriate them for the supposed things that they have and don't have, and then eating them. There's no cruelty in that. They're just defending what's theirs, because the invading whites should go back where they came from. Because the MIPS didn't do nothing. They're just protecting what's theirs. Why can't they be allowed to stab you to death and eat your body? They're just trying to live, bro. I just spelled venom. They're just trying to live, bro. You have no reason to be where they are in the hills. This is just like Appalachian country. We're only barely 20 minutes in!
These final shots are how these acts presented any different from those of the Jupiter family in the hills throughout the rest of the film. When concepts of wealth and influence are removed, and all that is left of the person is the basic need of survival, all that remains are two animalistic creatures rolling around to see who dies first in the dirt. Before we move on to the next film, I would like to quickly mention that if you enjoy my videos and want to continue seeing them in this style with more regularity, I would ask you to consider supporting me on Patreon. I love making videos like the one you are currently watching, but
No, you don't, because you did not like making shit like this, because you then chose to try and attack a person, using a hit piece as a guise, talking about bad conservative movies. Fuck out of here.
like this can be a bit difficult to swing financially, because they are often penalized because of their content and have their revenue taken away. Patreon is the only way that this channel can continue to function in the way that it does. And for just $1 a month, you can ensure that I have the ability to make these long-form videos about horror history in styles that are appropriate for the subjects, as well as ensure that I have the ability to do them more often. On Patreon, you will receive early access to videos when they are completed, as well as other occasional looks at my creative process. I recently posted a look at an unfinished script for a video that will no longer be happening, and will also be the only place for the foreseeable future where my third video on the history of witches can be found. It would also allow you access to the InPraiseOfShadows Discord server, where I hang out often. We have built a really nice community of great, lovely people there with regularly scheduled events, such as group movie discussions where we hang out in voice chat, and the creepy creative corner, where we get together and make art, as well as others. This coming Tuesday the 15th in Julian's Midnight Movie Mayhem event, we will be talking about King Cobra, which offers 30 feet of pure terror. If you like what I do and want to ensure that I continue to do it, supporting me there is the best way to make that a reality. But also just watching and sharing the videos is, as always, very much appreciated. Really, thank you so much for everything. The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is an unfortunate film made with disingenuous reasons, but also understandable ones. You can understand where I'm getting at with this when you see how its logo was presented in the original trailer, where it zooms out in a hue of purple before in a quick flash it freezes, and is replaced with the exact same red and white styling combo used in the titles of the Friday the 13th sequels. Even calling itself The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 instead of just The Hills Have Eyes 2. It is done with an intention to align itself with the current growing boom in horror, to almost say that this film was always just like those other current popular ones, which is a misrepresentation of what that first film was. If the original Hills Have Eyes is a purposeful commentary on wealth, commercialism, and American culture, then the sequel sadly is a demonstration of that. It is a rebranding of Hills into an attempted franchise starter, where year after year we can come and see the redneck hill people come down into the valley, and eat yet another group of rich white people who have crossed into their borders. Maybe the fifth one can take place in space, I don't know. It is, in some ways, everything that the first film sought out to protest. But I also said that it was an understandable move, and to me it is. In 1983, you see, Wes Craven had not yet become Wes Craven. He had not directed Nightmare on Elm Street, Shocker, The People Under the Stairs, or Scream. He was mostly just a guy named Wes.
Okay,
Even though this film was released a year after A Nightmare on Elm Street, and was advertised as Craven's next big film. It was actually shot a full year before production ever began on Elm Street, and sat on a shelf for 2.5 years before it was released. In fact, instead of reverence, when they shot this movie on a cultural level, his name sparked, if anything, the thought of being a bit scandalous or salacious. And also, definitely not a safe box office bet. Craven's first film, The Last House on the Left, was never really meant to be seen by people. To put it bluntly, it was made as an investment scam. It was intended, at least by him when making it, to be a trial run, to learn how to make a movie with a micro budget of only $90,000. A practice, if you will, before moving on to the real deal, with his career making actual mainstream movies for big audiences in the studios. He never wanted to be a horror guy, but had this opportunity come up and saw it as a cheap opening to figure out how this all worked. A sort of do-it-yourself film school. As he would describe it, I had never done a feature film before. I had never directed before, I had never cut before, I had never written a script before. So for me, who had just kind of left academia the year before, and was just learning the rhythms of how to cut film, it was a matter of discovering how to make a movie. Essentially, how this came to be is that Sean Cunningham of Friday the 13th fame struck up a deal with an investment group in Boston, who owned a chain of 30 to 40 small drive-in theaters in the Massachusetts area. And they realized that it would be cheaper to hire a crew and go out and make bad, quick-return fake movies that they could own the rights to forever and show them as much as they wanted for years, than it would be to purchase the rights to show a real, actual studio-produced movie for a limited amount of time.
Okay, so tell me how that's something that's wrong with what the film did, and tell me how that has anything to do with the diatribe that you've said thus far about its political aspirations. Because it says nothing.
Sean Cunningham then came to his friend Craven and said that he could get in on this and make one of these fake movies if he wanted, with the allowance that it could be about anything that he wanted and that he could show anything that he wanted, because this wasn't a real actual movie that was going to have to go through the rating system. The only caveat is that it had to be a horror movie. As he tells it, it was a matter of Sean having an offer from some backers in Boston who owned outdoor theaters to make them a scary movie, so they could use it as a second bill and not have to pay for 2 movies to distributors and suppliers. And so Sean came to me and said, I have some guys who are willing to give us a budget to go make a scary movie. Do you want to write a scary movie? So, it's 1973, and you can see things from their logic. Why pay $150,000 to show Beware the Blob on your screens, when you could pay Wes Craven and crew $90,000 to go out and make The Last House on the Left? Would your average audience member really notice? And if they did, would they even care? To put this all into context, in a way this is exactly what Netflix started doing a decade ago with their decision to produce Netflix originals for their own service, to begin phasing out other content that they didn't own and have exclusive access to. But they just did it to such a large-scale degree that they turned it into a legitimate business model that's become an industry standard. Until, you know, it becomes clear that infinite growth is not sustainable and it all comes tumbling down.
Well, you see, it's not sustainable in the case of Disney because Disney doesn't care about the properties that they're taking. Just like you don't care about the things that you're trying to assimilate to your political narrative. You can't make infinite profit because there is no such thing as infinite profit. You can't make money from nothing. Something has to be of cost. Either your mind, your body, your soul, your spirit, your rhyme, your reason, the monetary benefit that came with making it, as well as the emotional cost. If it doesn't have an emotional interest, people can't connect to it. And we haven't even talked about what's in the film. We're talking about the history of the film. But it feels less about the anatomy of the franchise and more about how Wes Craven is a secret undercover Antifa activist. Only awakened when the Splinter Cell needed him most. Sounds like Copa. Sounds like Big Copa. A Big Copa Cedar.
That's actually a practice called vertical integration, and was very much illegal until about 2019, when the Trump administration officially phased it out. But it was definitely still technically illegal when Netflix started doing it, or at least close enough to being illegal that it should have been questioned more at the time.
Yeah, it should have been, but y'all motherfuckers didn't care.
Absolute strictest reading of the law on paper with no interpretation. It only prohibits movie studios from owning movie theaters that hold exclusive rights to their content, or forcing theaters into exclusive dealings. But a looser and more applied reading of that should in theory probably apply to streaming services, as they have sadly become the modern equivalent to the movie theater, and all laws are—
No, it's worse. It's become cable. Which is exactly what they were supposed to be replacing.
interpreted differently over
And it's still nothing on!
time to account for changing technologies and the way that people interact with businesses. Back in the 1940s, if you asked the average person what companies made culturally relevant entertainment, their answers probably would have been Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, Fox, or MGM. And if you were to ask that same question today, they would say Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, HBO Max, or Amazon.
Which are basically all blended into the exact same brands, with the exception of MGM. But see, they have Winter King, so that's different.
And these modern companies should be held to the exact same legal standard that those were in the past, and not be—
But they won't be, because you people don't actually care. If you cared, you realize that's where the real monopoly is. That's where the real people making hand over fist on your credibility are. Those are the people that are taking minorities that you decided to use so haphazardly here to say that it's an allegory for and a representation of a resistance of those living off the meat of the land, resisting those who come from the inner city. They're the ones that are taking those people and using you as tokens. But you eat it up anyways, because, my inclusion! I feel so represented! Well, you could have something like this be put inside of Godzilla X Kong, the new empire, and we can have all the jokes saying, yes, finally, I feel seen! A fat autistic person who makes podcasts like me! You can't say that about these things, because these things are garbage! They're dog shit! Many of them don't deserve to exist. Now, the ones that are funny, like Jessica Jones and the Santa Clarita Diet, the only way they are justifiable as good is if they can achieve a bit of progress.
They're allowed to get away with anything that they want to, because
5
their actions are
degrees close to good, as something like Bob's Burgers. And granted, that's not even on the level of what most people would expect. Some people would probably say Archer, but in the case of FX and FXX, their particular direct service, if they're not directly putting it onto other platforms now, there's not many things to compare, because all the good shows already went off the air before the streaming services ever came. And now their rights are being shuffled around, works cannibalized, efforts taken, entire credits erased, as entire shows being taken off of these broadcast syndications because somebody wasn't willing to pay enough money for the fucking rights. CEOs destroying the works of those minorities you so love to claim that you defend and protect. A actual cannibalization of the rights. Professional rights, creative rights, working rights. Something you should be all about, if what you're about is the love of the genre, while getting the most visceral reactions from the genre. They're destroying it for everything it is and commercializing it. But you don't care. Because they didn't say fuck Trump, I guess.
the direct result of the downslide of modern film culture. There is a clear difference before and after roughly 2010 in the types of media that was being made and the discourse of how it was being talked about. And the primary difference in that is the amount of money that these companies were allowed to bring in compared to before, because they now control an unprecedented share of the market. as well as how much they were allowed to control the narrative, which is a substantial amount. Sadly, anti-consumerism has become the accepted norm, but I guess the basic idea is that nothing is really against the law unless you're prosecuted for it.
Well, yes, it's only illegal if you're caught. Yes, that is true. That is actually one thing you've said that is absolutely true that I would never be able to deny. And yet, if it's only illegal,
Hello.
hello. If it's only,
Hello, I
hello.
got my ice cream.
Hello. If it's only illegal when you're caught, you're literally saying the cannibals didn't do nothing.
Oh, I had a really good joke earlier, but I was muted, so no one heard it.
That's unfortunate. Maybe you'll get another chance to say it. It'll be less funny now because now we know that you have a joke percolating that will come down the line, so it won't be as spontaneous. Hello. The instructions are already inside of the voice channel.
Wait,
I take it you didn't watch the podcast last night.
unfortunately I did not, but I see what it is now.
Yes. We announced that we would be doing this at noon today, but unfortunately I get in late from my wife's house after helping her, so we're doing it today.
Yeah, I saw the announcement. It's just that I just I thought it wasn't this one.
What else did you think it was going to be? We already covered the whole topic of the guy on the podcast. This is where he said he got the idea to do the attack piece on Wendigo. So we're understanding his logic and his ideas, and we are only 27 minutes in of a 1 hour, 45-minute video. And the arguments just keep piling up and piling up and piling up. Right now, he actively identified that, yes, streaming services have become new cable, and new cable sucks, just like old cable sucked. But he has not identified that, no, all of those things doesn't mean anything. Because as he's complaining about corporations and governance and worse, capitalism bad, he just gave an excuse about why the cannibals didn't do anything. If it's only illegal if you get prosecuted for making a horrible hegemon and oligarchy and plutocracy for yourselves, and it's only illegal if you get caught, should the cannibals truly be victims? Because they're just eating the rich as they were intended to. Literally! It's only illegal if they get caught and they live out in the bumfuck desert, so who cares? Fuck Whitey! How dare you invade the desert?
It was an antitrust law that seemed to hardly be enforced in the past couple of decades, to the point that it just eroded completely by the time of our current so-called streaming wars. Mostly because it benefited these large companies and the economy for it to not be enforced. It was decided on a federal level in the United States versus Paramount Pictures case of 1948, in an attempt at preventing monopolies from growing within the entertainment industry. The basic concept is that the person who owns the means of production cannot be the same person who owns the mean of distribution of that product. It's why in the film business and all other businesses, you have production companies and you have distributors. It's a weird callback to the days when the concept of having billionaires was still considered to be a bad thing, and that competition was good for the whole world. When applied at the time, it really meant that a film studio could not control the entire market. It could not own their own theaters that only played their movies exclusively, and it also banned exclusive dealing arrangements, which effectively meant that studios could not have a strong arm over private theaters, and demand that their movies be played for a specific amount of time, or how many screens their movies took up. A tactic that Disney is notorious for doing today, which...
Yeah, because you guys don't care about these rules, because as long as they're able to make allegory about Trump bad, you don't care what they say or what they do, because you're all stuck on contemporary politics. Yet again, another thing that you have not noticed. Hello, Saul. It is really stupid that you still have not figured this out yet. How are you not figuring this out yet, Shadows?
will soon run traditional theaters into the ground, which is probably their ultimate long-term goal. Now that
And it's not going to hurt the people in the majority of the market that are benefiting from it most off, because they aren't making money on the theaters. They're making money on the digital cable streaming services and premium packages, all rolled in together with all those other things that you just said were bad. Why would they care about destroying something out in the world when most people are paying indoors, indoors, indoors?
that vertical integration is completely legal.
Take it away,
They can replace them
Henny.
once they're gone with their own Disney-branded theaters.
Whoop,
Netflix started out as a distributor. They purchased the streaming and distribution rights to a product from other entertainment companies, and then put them on their platform. But by the time the
Oh,
Netflix
yeah, I
originals
remember
were a
when they
thing,
used to do-
nobody with power really
Yep. It was crazy for me to see Redbox. Because I did not understand the concept of Netflix. Like, I'm paying you to deliver DVDs to my house and then I send them back? Bro, that's crazy.
seem to care anymore if mega
And
corporations took over.
Redbox
It
is
became
slightly more convenient, though.
It is. And it's also more commonly used in the hood. Ironically,
Oh, yeah, it is.
Ironically enough, black people will not steal from the Redbox.
You know what?
Did they
That's
used to
commendable.
steal from Blockbuster?
Yes. Black
Huh.
people were notorious for being the kind of individuals that either they were the kind of customer that rented a game or a movie and they tried to speed run using it for content in the time of a 3-day rental, or they would do what was known as rent to steal to buy, which was they would rent a game, they would continue to like have it for a period of time where they just kept racking up late fees and charges to where the stores started getting replacement copies, so that if a person effectively refused to bring it back, they started charging it as a purchasing fee. So you would be paying for the full price of that retail object rather than paying the rental fee. So let's use modern video games and modern movies as an example. A modern movie ticket costs about $15 for commission, and if you're also lapping it into the idea of the rewatchability of the product as a part of the concessions you're paying for, that's $15 to $36. A basic DVD bundle, maybe on a box set for the first four seasons of a long-running series that has 8 episodes, could be as much as that. And of course, the actual streaming packages for the services compete in dollar amount price from $20 up to $100 a year. Some monthly, some yearly. And that's just the American products and anime. That doesn't mean anything for all of the exclusives. The amount of money that you're supposed to get on that return would basically be ported out to you as a purchase price cost. So, if I was to rent something like Onimusha Dawn of Souls, that, when I think my family rented it, was maybe $7 rental for 3 days. If we didn't return it, they would tack on what would have been at the time an appropriate cost amount. Considering that game was old from the PS2 era and used, maybe $30, $40. Because it's a vintage old game that's being kept in semi-good condition, with a little bit of restoring every now and again here and there. Because video stores specialized in having VCR repair, game system repair, and a bunch of other shit that they didn't actually have. Because retrofitting for a console and having retro game shops were a lot more popular versus people doing everything digitally. Because if you're doing everything digital, why would your computer need to have an optics drive for you to get to DVDs? Why would your computer need to have an optics drive if the majority of the things that you own are not from a direct collection of a physical disc, but instead you getting a digital game from a digital storefront? The problem itself is a concept of the issue, which is a stem of a symptom. He can correctly identify the problem of the system, but he doesn't have an answer for how to stem the tide of the flow. The blood that you're losing from the result of the bleeding of the wound is stop paying into the system. In this case, if you identify that you don't like streaming services cannibalizing the industry, stop paying for a subscription service, start pirating everything you watch, and make money hand over fist at the expense of the corporation. They will stop seeing a profit margin return. They will take extreme losses. And ironically enough, those who are dirt poor, will rake in profit at the expense of the rich that are supposedly destroying the things you love. But that doesn't occur to him! Because, you see, these corporations are putting up the right viewpoints and the right opinions and the right arguments and the right content with the correct mindset and the correct kind of creator and actors and messaging. So he doesn't care, actually, because they called the people in the movie Nazi chuds or incel chuds. So it's okay, because, you see, they think like I do instead of thinking oppositely than I do. those of you who watch the podcast in full knows why that is. We're already seeing the inklings that lead to him wanting to harass Wendigoon. Right here. Right here. Again, we're barely 30 minutes in to an hour and 25-minute video. Now, granted, I'm not writing any of this down because this is obvious. It's obvious in the allegories he keeps making. But I would be behooven to not mention it. Because it's simple. It's so simple, a child could literally understand it. So why is it that this childish understanding of the world is being said by a person who's talking about the highest echelon of horror enjoyment? That's crazy. Nappy-headed Negro is beating the shit out of horror enthusiasts. King me, bitch!
Monopolies, and that the whole country was run by 5 to 10 boardrooms. It was a concept that was slowly broken down over a long period of time, brick by brick, chipped away by things like Mad Men, The Walking Dead, and Breaking Bad on AMC, premium cable like HBO, and a couple of decades of first-party games being exclusive to individual consoles.
That is completely different to industries like that of Hollywood trying to own and conglomerize the very concept of the ladder of corporate success. The same way that a first-party proprietary console can have exclusives is kept up by the competition of the business. This, again, is a thing you just fucking said. If I want to play Onimusha Dawn of Souls, I have to have a PS2. But I can also go onto the internet and get this thing called a PCSX2 emulator, along with the PCSX emulator. 2 emulators that I have been a part of the development team for, that has completely perfectly recreated and also emulated using direct official files and the direct official BIOS of both the PSX and the PS2 to properly and fully make almost every single game from those libraries fully playable on PC. Which brings me to the exact reason why I had that diatribe earlier about the PC disc optics drives. In an age where the last blockbuster only exists up in Oregon, why would I need to worry about getting an optics drive for my computer when I can instead get an executable that allows me to emulate the very things that require the discs? All I need is an internet connection and an SSD drive. I want for naught. Because I can have all of them. Because I could emulate all of them. Because first party doesn't exist if it has the ability to be recreated on PC. This isn't even an argument. This is literally just true. Same shit as rents to steal to buy. It's crazy. Why does he act like pirating isn't a thing, or is things like Freeves? Well, I don't know. Maybe he's a purist. Perhaps InPraiseOfShadows is a purist who believes that you shouldn't be able to take something that you didn't pay for. Which, granted, isn't unfair, but the problem is that if I am expected to pay original prices for a 20-year-old game, you're fucking smoking. That's what emulation exists for. It's over 20 years old. It is not worth $150. I don't care what the fuck anyone says about it. For all the kind of games that required special peripheral hardware to interact with them, like that of Boktai 1 and Boktai 2, or the particular voice system for something like Takeshi's Challenge for the Famicom. Every game that has ever had an innovation concept that requires you to use specific and special things is not something that should be looked at as though it is a detriment, but it's instead a positive. I mean, shit, for all the times people have tried to compare Hideo Kojima to that of, ironically enough, Neil Druckmann. Neil Druckmann is just an idiot who tried to make a really bad bastardization of Cannibal Holocaust off the theft writings that he took from Maniac. Whereas Hideo Kojima is a person who has thought of multiple different things that has demonstrated that he understands how to make peripheral mashups and changes work for him, and work for his style, and work for his ideas. He is a man of demonstration and action, not a man of philosophical tartness. That's why his games are good, even if you could claim they have a movie feel. He understands what he's going for, he has a vision, and he sticks to it. And ironically enough, all of those games can be emulated extremely well. Meanwhile, over in the Neil Druckmann camp, who is right alongside InPraiseOfShadows, He's willing to constantly bash on philosophies that he is poorly demonstrating with his words and his actions. And more than likely, if he was to have his way of the world, he would do the same thing that Sony and Naughty Dog did, which was hiring a third-party collaborator who would basically break your Nico kneecaps. It's ridiculous. It doesn't deserve anything other than contempt. Blind, wild contempt. Because it is actual theft. It is actual political garbage. It is actual fucking politicized and aggrandized level of CEO greed that should always be looked at in the face and said, I don't want to give you my money because you don't deserve it. And yet, that is exactly what he's arguing for when he says these things. He can act like however the fuck he wants to, saying that it's a product of a bygone era, but it's not. It is just the direct result of somebody demonstrating that they do not get what is really important. And his example of trying to compare the video game market to the Hollywood industry is hilarious. Now, granted, they're going the same way because they're tying themselves in the same way, but that's for first-party AAA exclusives. Specifically between... Actually, no. Specifically just Sony. Technically, Sony of America from Santa Monica, because they're already from Santa Monica. Because that's where the cultural rot is stemming from. The call is not only coming from inside the mansion; it is literally coming from the exact same Google Voice line. They're in your head. They're in your head. Now I'll be right back. He, in fact, like the kids do say, did indeed lose the blah blah. Yeah, I have returned. Let's continue.
It is an idea that seems very normal to us now, but it really shouldn't be. It was against the law for a long time and was done so, in my opinion, for good reasons. Because it forced smaller companies to work with each other to make art, rather than Disney and Amazon dictating how culture is defined. It's not that Netflix had a revolutionary idea of having a whole line of original programming for their platform, all done in-house. They were just the first ones to do so at a large scale and not care if it was possibly illegal or not. But what was going on here with The Last House on the Left would definitely constitute as vertical integration, which means that technically, Wes Craven's start in the film business was a tad shady. And this whole thing stressed Craven out a bit. As he said, I didn't know anything about scary movies. I was raised in a family and a church where filmmaking was forbidden, so I had no background in film to speak of whatsoever.
And the fact that he struck out and made it big should be commemorated, because it means he, again, like the things you're claiming, pulled himself out of the muck.
My whole background was in ferocious book reading. I grew up in the Baptist church, so no listening to records or watching movies, along with alcohol and dancing and everything else. Disney films, those were okay. That was the one exception. So I saw every Disney film that came out. And at first, I wanted to be a Disney animator. I literally remember a conversation along the lines of, Sean, I don't know anything about making a scary movie. And Sean said, well, you were raised as a fundamentalist. Just pull all the skeletons out of your closet. And with that advice, he just casually went off and made The Last House on the Left. Which also explains the crazy tone and hyper-surreal violence of it, because it is someone's idea of what a concept of a horror movie might be like, who they themselves had not actually watched any horror movies. It's like if you introduced the concept of swearing to someone who had never heard of such a thing, and then told them to give it a shot, only for them to turn around and say the most filthy thing you've ever heard in your life. And one thing that I love about this is that it demonstrates that anyone could really become a legend in different industries if they were just given a chance.
But you didn't try to do that for yourself, now did you? Nah!
Like we wouldn't have Ghostface or Freddy Krueger if this investment firm hadn't decided to cheat audiences by hiring people who had never worked in film before to make fake movies for them.
But, you see, that's the genius, you see? Because people that don't have any idea of what they should be writing for will come up with the most innovative ideas possible. Because they're not constrained. are the limitations of having a filled cup. You never emptied your cup. You know all these details, and you have all these takes, and you have all these things, but you never applied it to yourself in the future. That's crazy!
Anyone out there is capable of genius. Everyone is capable of making culturally important, artistically driven works, if they are just given the chance to do so, like Wes Craven was here. He himself admits that he wasn't allowed to watch movies or TV until he went to college, and learned about this whole artistic medium and world. Which is also why he didn't know about any horror films or how to make them, because he learned about film through college. So his entire knowledge up to that point was foreign art films from people like Brunel, Bergman, Truffaut, and Fellini, which I also find really funny. He didn't get to watch movies until he was almost 20, and went on to have a lifetime career in the medium, and even before his passing was revered as a master of the craft. And I think that not only speaks to his natural artistic talents and also explains some of the wonky decisions that he made in his early movies, but also can stand as a parable that says that everyone has intrinsic value, and if given the right circumstances, could make some really cool things, or be considered a massive success.
Unless they think differently than you, then of course they're Nazi bigots who live in the mountains, and they appropriate a culture that they are literally born into by blood, and they don't deserve what they have, because they didn't have to work for it, because they got it at a young age, despite the fact that their entire family had nothing, because they were conservative, religious, and are humble in a way that you cannot be, because you're spite-driven. Yes, 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 there's that hypocriticism, yeah!
Everyone has a story that they could tell that is tied directly to who they are as an individual. And with the original deal with that movie, he made it under the impression that it would have a very limited run at a few drive-ins in a very centralized area of the country, and that he could do or say or show anything that he wanted to, because nobody was really going to see this thing that they cobbled together in a few weekends anyway. But the tragic thing about The Last House on the Left is that it was good. And ultimately that changed everything with their plan, and Craven soon found himself being the writer and director of a film that he thought would only be seen by a handful of people in a small chain of theaters, receiving a full national theatrical rollout. And for its time, it is a shockingly violent film. Some would today still consider it to be disturbing. But as he said in his own words about the conditions that it was made under, going in, I thought I'd never have to worry about anyone in my past going to see it. Which proved not to be the case whatsoever. It gave me a freedom to be outrageous, to go to areas that normally I wouldn't have gone into. And
In other words, he was giving himself permission to create true art, instead of somebody pretending to be artistic.
not worry about my family hearing about it or being crushed. And once it did get released nationwide and became a bit of a cultural fear-mongering crisis that could be the subject of its own video, as the writer and director, Craven was the main focus of where that attention went to, and where the conversation was surrounded. What he thought was an experiment in learning how to make a movie turned into a national statement piece. And it sadly seems that it made the next few years of his life a sort of strange personal hell that was somewhat of his own making that he didn't foresee and certainly didn't deserve. He said on this period of his life, "My marriage had failed at this time, and I was living on the Lower East Side in a group apartment, and it was a very rich amalgamation of people, academics and hipsters and dope dealers and musicians, and they all went to see my movie when it came out. And almost all of them were appalled. I literally had people who would no longer leave their children alone with me, or people that would, when they found out I had directed the film, say, that was the most despicable thing I had ever seen, and walk out of the room. So there was a very strong, very real revulsion, to the point where I almost didn't want to talk about what I did for a living or what I made, and that lasted a long time. And then he follows that up, as I said earlier, with The Hills Have Eyes, because he felt trapped in his career, and the only thing that he could get hired for was another exploitation film. He followed that up with another non-hit, Dead Upon Arrival, Deadly Blessing, which is mostly only notable for doing almost the exact same bathtub sequence from Nightmare a decade earlier, except this time it's a big snake. This period that follows that consists of films that are trying to be big, empty, cultural box office trash, like Swamp Thing and The Hills Have Eyes 2. It's his period of trying to sell out hard, trying to make a big hit happen because his career was on the line. And after everything that he had gone through, I don't blame him for turning to popcorn movies to try and pull him out of this hole. Swamp Thing and The Hills Have Eyes were not successful in that attempt, but 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street was, and cemented his legacy within the genre, and turned Wes Craven into Wes Craven. In an attempt to further solidify its standing in horror as well as its continued derivativeness of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 begins with an opening crawl read by a deep-voiced man, in almost the exact same font and shade of yellow as the text from the opening of that film. It works well enough as a callback, but is one of the many constant reminders of the film insisting that it is important to the history of horror like those other movies are, instead of trying to do something original for itself. The basic premise and conceptual themes of the franchise itself are almost entirely just rebranded Chainsaw. Although I do like the last line of this block of text that reads, "And of those who did survive, none can forget that far out in the unmapped desert, beyond the towns and roads, the hills still have eyes." In the first scene, Bobby's therapist refers to Papa Jupiter by saying, "You don't have to worry anymore. The boogeyman is dead." A clear and deliberate callback of the film connecting itself to both Sam Loomis and Michael Myers of Halloween. And here within the first 5 minutes we have the film invoking the Muses, to attach itself to 3 major cultural horror films, in the form of the Part 2 font, the opening crawl, and Loomis. And this kind of thing can work, but is something that has to be earned in my opinion. The Bride of Chucky opens just like this, but they had many movies over the course of a decade to establish and solidify Chucky as a horror icon.
And he's entirely camp, which is different. So why are you comparing them? They come from 2 different worlds. Focus. 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 Focus.
He had already entered the public zeitgeist in a big bad way. So it is cute at the beginning of the film to have quick flashes of Michael and Jason's masks, Freddy's glove, and Leatherface's chainsaw. It feels more of a cute referential nod to contemporaries of the same level. It is not a self-insistence of status. To put it bluntly, one feels as if they are fully aware on a cultural level of what they had created, and know that they belong among the names that they were invoking, while the other feels a bit desperate. This opening to the film is why I say that Craven was best suited for his scream output than anything else, because he clearly with that, as well as New Nightmare, was more interested in talking about how horror was connected to people and popular culture, and the people who made it, rather than making outright standalone horror itself.
In other words, becoming the thing that you wanted to make your channel on? I think we see a comparison! This nigga thinks he's Wes Craven!
His style and writing was critical both to the good and bad aspects of the genre, and how they related to us as the audience, and what that said about us and what that said about the people who thought up these terrible things to show off as entertainment. He has said that the shame he felt from bringing The Last House on the Left into the world sort of tainted how he saw his career for a long time. It hung over an entire section of his life like a dark cloud. In the early 90s, he famously walked out of a screening of Reservoir Dogs because of how violent it was. And I think that kind of mind and thought process was best directed with the creative outputs that he focused on in the second half of his career. Also, in relation to all of this, I just wanted to point out that later on here in part 2, probably because of their connection to Sean Cunningham and the nature of making films for very little amounts of money, they reuse a lot of the same bass musical beats as Friday the 13th in this, and at times it can be very distracting. The really bizarre thing about the setup of this movie is that it teases a story about Bobby from the first movie and his trauma over what happened in that stretch of Nevada desert in 1977. Here, in 1983, when the film was shot and was originally intended to be released, he is still in therapy from these events, and based on the conversation that we are allowed access to, it seems as if he's made little progress in this time in unpacking these events. Still hasn't come to terms with what happened to his family, and what they were forced to do to survive. What he was forced to do when he gunned down Papa Jupiter after his sister chopped him in the back. But then, we don't see him again for the rest of the movie. He is not the main character or really a character in the narrative. He just has a prologue front-loaded before the actual story begins. And if the film wanted to continue its thematic threads from the first film,
The thematic threads of white yuppies are destroying the countryside, and people who live in that countryside that are the financial fiscal minorities have a due diligence and right to murder and eat them and go crazy from the brain-melting prions.
it could have explored concepts related to survivor's guilt, or undertones of white guilt, tying into how he got into the situation at the first place, while also having to live with the knowledge that he and his people had destroyed another's culture for their own survival.
The culture of murdering people and eating them as sociopathic hillbilly cannibals that are incel bait and reject bait. I should have white guilt. How dare I try to survive in a dog-eat-dog world? Oh, woe is me that I understand the meaning of canis canem edict. For those of you who don't know, that is Latin for dog-eat-dog.
The guilt that the winner has to, or at least should, sit with after their conquest is over and all of their wars have been won. But nothing like that is attempted here, because the movie is no longer a critique of American culture or the power dynamics that have been slowly built and solidified to be more unbalanced over the past few hundred years.
Okay, so what is it?
This is Craven trying to make an accessible movie that would be a hit with audiences. So instead, we focus on the hip, college-aged friends of Bobby, who are taking an experimental fuel to a dirt bike race across the country. And wouldn't you know it, their bus just happens to break down right in the middle of Nevada. What are the chances? Not only that, but it just so happens to be the exact same location that their friend Bobby and his family got trapped in all those years ago, where some of them got eaten. And their friend Rachel? Well, turns out, she's actually Ruby, the daughter of Papa Jupiter. And also, if you thought that this was all going to tie into the plot somehow, and that she arranged them to get trapped here because of some family alliance, you'd be mistaken. It really is all a big coincidence that doesn't go anywhere. But I don't want to be too mean to this. It is clear that it is a product of really unfortunate circumstances.
No, it's just called plot contrivance, bro. It's bad writing. That's all it is. It's okay. You don't have to lie to us. You don't have to drop it up. There's a lot of things that happen because of plot contrivance. We usually call those things plot holes. It's alright. It's okay. You ain't gotta lie to me. You ain't gotta lie to me. It's alright. We write a stinker every once and again. It's okay, bro. It's okay. It's okay. Bruh, cannibals in our culture. True. Bro, the cannibals literally set up the trap in the first movie to strand the family. Do the same thing in the second movie. He's weeding Ray into it. They're not the good guys. I am not sure what you mean by that, Rain Explorer, because I'm not reading it from the position of what he's trying to say here in the anatomy of the film. He said himself that he wrote his hit piece about Wendigoon based on his opinions that he had about the hills had eyes because of the Native American culture. As you can clearly see here on the notepad, written here at the top, one of the first things he specifically mentions is these particular lines. Specifically, leading right here to the highlighted sections. So, yeah. You're talking about the video, not you, Carl. Okay. Alright. Glad we established that. And I don't have to now say the thing I was about to say. It's more playing upon the fears of college kids that would watch this film than source out of deeper commentary. I mean, I suppose it's a popcorn film. This is at least correct to his own words. It was Wes Craven's attempt to try and garner a franchise-creating audience machine. But at the same time, he's saying all these things that could have possibly happened rather than just going off of what actually fucking happened. It's less the anatomy of a film, and it's more an example to make some shit sound like it's smart, but it's not.
Some of which are just a result of the idea that turning The Hills Have Eyes into a franchise is a really bad one. And there is some charm and craft to this as well. From the very first shot, you can tell how much more technically and emotionally competent Craven has gotten with a camera. It's amazing how watchable The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes ended up being, considering they were made by someone who was in their 20s who practically didn't know what a movie was until they were about 18 or so. But this is the first movie of his that mostly has that smooth, thoughtful Craven feel to it. That suburban idealization. I always felt that especially in this time period of his career in the 1980s, he was kind of like if John Hughes had gone into the horror movie making business. And this is really the first time that that is on display in his work. The camera has a placement that was considered to really capture the emotions of the characters, instead of just the basic action. In lesser words, this feels like more of an actual movie than anything he'd ever done before, at least in the camera department. And it really goes to show the growth that he had made as an artist in just a few years' time. On a technical visual level, The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 is a completely different beast than its predecessor. What before were simple, unfocused shots of the desert landscape now bring a hint of dread with their implications. But there's just a whole lot holding this film back, with one of the main ones being the horrible use of flashbacks. They were a reality of this era of movies. It's not like people could just throw in the Blu-ray the day before they go see the sequel. So it was an important feature in sequels to make sure the audience remembered what happened the last time. But there are movies that did this well, and then there's others like this and the Maniac Cop sequels that do it quite poorly. Everyone in this gets a flashback to the events of the first film, even the dog. But unfortunately, this was also done for a specific reason. When making this in 1983, they got roughly 2/3 of the way through shooting the movie, and then the studio decided that they actually didn't want to release it. So they immediately canceled the production and put the footage in a warehouse. But then the next year comes around, and A Nightmare on Elm Street comes out, and suddenly they were sitting on an unfinished film made by Wes Craven. And they offered to pay him to come in and do a salvage edit of the film out of the footage that they had shot, which is why some parts of this movie are a little hard to follow, because a third of the story is missing. And the flash...
So you would just make it again. You would make it over again. You as the company would have to sit there and, in your own words, Shadows, oh no, we've destroyed the work of a working artist. I stopped the painting in the middle of its shading and coloring. Please, Craven, please forgive us. We will give you infinite money. Please, just finish the film. I mean, I can't do it. Y'all fucked it up. I gotta find a dojo. Gotta find a mojo. Gotta start over again. Gotta go back to the canvas. But the canvas is good. Can't do it. You fucked it. We'll do anything, please. Just you use flashbacks. Please, use flashbacks. I mean, alright. We ain't gonna like it. An open-shut example of the shit that you just talked about. The superfluous use of capitalism, cannibalizing a working artist, making them feast on the flesh of their very soul, pouring into their work, bastardized and then repackaged like processed pork to an audience to consume like never-ending streams of hot dogs and hamburgers and pork chops. Again, this is supposed to be the anatomy of a franchise, and you decided to try and pivot into political activism. So if you're going to try and marry the two things together with your political worldview, go the whole way. Don't take no half measures. You saw what that got for them here, considering they fucked over Wes Craven. Don't do no half measures. Go all the way in. Go all the way in.
Flashbacks were used to get the film up to an acceptable runtime because they had so little footage to work with. Craven was never really keen on sequels being made to Elm Street, and I wonder if one of those reasons was the horrible experience of filming and editing the sequel, which he would later go on to disown. Another unfortunate thing that this movie picks up from this time period of horror sequels is that the middle section is largely a meandering mess of teenagers, talking about things that don't really matter, screaming while running through the dark, and accidentally walking in on each other naked in the shower.
Because that was the 80s. It was salacious, and it's what made money. Again, this is the capitalism part that you say that you dislike. But even if you're criticizing it, you know what it is for the product at this time, so you simply need to explain it and move on. The section should not be this long.
The film starts with some pretty good energy, but soon after the bus breaks down, the film slows to an absolute crawl. It just stays in this territory for most of the runtime with this unmoving plot.
Because Wes Craven learned how to do better camera work. He didn't learn how to be a better script writer. Assuming that this is all his original idea, and he's the one who wrote the script, he needed somebody to help him with the draft. Because it's poor fucking blocking, camera work positioning, camera work placements in continuity with what the character should be feeling, and ultimately, a not tight screenplay. That's okay. But you know, you're not telling the truth on that because you're not really giving a full understanding.
None of that frenetic
Maybe you will later on, but you haven't done it yet.
energy that was brought to the first one and made that the classic that it is here. It's all just okay, but it is definitely an attempt at a capital H blockbuster horror film, aimed at a primarily middle and high school aged audience. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, it just is what it is. What was before more thoughtful and purposeful use of imagery, characters, and setting for commentary, now has turned into tropey and predictable situations aiming for a least common denominator audience. But as I said, seeing as where things were in his life at the time, it's completely understandable why he would want to make a movie like this. Artistic merit means little when you can't afford to feed yourself. There's a clear line before and after he made A Nightmare on Elm Street. And that line delineated a difference between a period where he couldn't afford to take risks and a period where he could. A similar concept to the two careers of Stanley Kubrick, consisting of one before and one after he made Dr. Strangelove. The most accurate statement made by a character in the film comes in the climax, where Roy stands up to the villain and yells, "The Reaper sucks," because he very much does. And I think is a bit emblematic of The Hills Have Eyes Part 2 in general. The first film with Papa Jupiter was the embodiment of lower-class rage, who was standing up and attempting to take back what he and his family deserved. But the Reaper is none of that. He is a bumbling, soulless hillbilly, who wants nothing except death, blood, and carnage. And he knows nothing and stands for nothing. He is the blabbering face of the film. He's even on the poster twice. And very little about him and his design works. In every single way, he is a step down from what came before. He is one of the worst attempts at creating an iconic horror villain in an 80s movie. And watching this is so strange considering that he was created by Craven, who would just in 1 year go on to create Freddy Krueger. And the really upsetting thing about this is that Michael Berryman was right there. The only thing about The Hills Have Eyes that anyone who hasn't seen it knows about it is him. He is the face of those movies, easily the most iconic aspect that has remained through time over anything else. And he's allowed to do next to nothing in this movie. He has no presence here outside of being the initial threat, which is quickly dealt with. Which is a real shame because he actually has a motive after being almost killed by Carter's dog in the last film. It is so logical to make him the next big villain who took over after Papa Jupiter's death. And the fact that Craven didn't do that and instead decided to make this new character that we have never met before, that we also have no attachment to, fill that role, was a really bad call.
So it means it was probably corporate overture. And somebody who was an executive fucked with him. And said, no, it needs to be iconically scary. Which, they didn't know what iconic means. Ironic enough, same as Deborah was. But how does that actually apply to anything else and has to tie to anything else? We have a whole bunch of notes that came from you deciding to get politically active. And now you ain't making sense with none of this shit.
But again, I want to emphasize that this really isn't all that bad. As along with being shot really well, it has an absolutely fantastic score from Harry Manfredini, who has been doing excellent genre work since the 70s, who most notably scored the Friday the 13th films. And this score is so good at times, and deserves to be used with a much better movie than the one it's being actually laid over top of. And there's something for me here about this ending that I absolutely love, where the completely blind from birth Cass is stuck in the Reaper's pit of body remains, feeling around with her bare hands trying to find a way out, with all the while the Reaper is down there stalking her in the dark. It's a weirdly tense moment for an otherwise flat movie, and reminds me of how Jonathan Demme would shoot the basement sequence in The Silence of the Lambs a decade later. Ultimately, despite paying Craven to come in and finish editing something that is somewhat watchable and doing what he could with what they had shot on the film, the decision was made that this was not good enough to send to theaters, as it would damage their reputation as a studio. It was then sold to a television distributor to gain back some of the sunk cost, ran occasionally as a pay-per-view event, and was mostly lost in the infinite history of rushed horror sequels. And what was intended to be a franchise starter, essentially ensured that The Hills Have Eyes was a dead brand beyond resuscitation. Now, there is no logical or seamless way to interject this into the script, but I did want to point out something funny related to this franchise.
So it was just something you decided to push in because reasons. Okay, that's fine. Give it to me.
Jim Wynorski, who we've talked about in the past as the writer and director of the excellent Chopping Mall, would go on to make a sequel to Craven's Swamp Thing film called The Return of Swamp Thing.
They call me Swamp Thing.
But sadly by the 90s, his horror career fizzled out, and to make ends meet, he began to make adult film parodies of famous horror movies for Cinemax, including The Bear Winch Project, Cheerleader Massacre, The Witches of Brestwick, and of course, The Hills Have Thighs, none of which we will be reviewing here.
Okay, so why did you mention it? And what's the point? How is this the anatomy of the franchise of The Hills Have Eyes? It's just a man making money. Well, you see, Carl, because of his inability to be able to play on the corporate ladder of profitability over people's morals and values, he debased himself in the only way a person can creatively do so inside of the industry, going from writing sheer pure art into thrill-seeking pleasure bait through that of the pornographic industry of adult filmmaking. Fucking over people's lives and women's bodies is a man's world where they get hard to parodies that they come to. Tell me!
Go out to a movie.
The 1990s was basically Craven's decade. He had a great start in the early 80s, but his body of work at the end of the decade and leading into the 90s was particularly impressive, with a constant string of titles like The Serpent and the Rainbow, Shocker, The People Under the Stairs, New Nightmare, Vampire in Brooklyn, Scream, and Scream 2. In the early to mid-90s, there were talks with Craven about possibly coming back to make another Hills film, with a considerably larger budget, which didn't happen entirely, but somewhat did in the form of 1995's Mind Ripper, that was only produced by Craven, but was also written by his son Jonathan, that many see as an unofficial Part 3. Which sadly shows that Jonathan didn't quite get the writing chops for small budgets that his father had. From the very first moments, you can already tell that it has similarities that relate to that series, revolving around a group of nuclear researchers out in a facility buried in the desert. It feels like a setup for them to soon be attacked by the Hill People, although that doesn't happen here. The style is a little exaggerated and campy in a somewhat 90s way, and is a big departure from what we would expect based on the first two films. We have a character that walks around with a VR headset on. Everyone talks in that distinctive writing style that you recognize immediately but is difficult to describe. And we are introduced to our main cast in a really goofy way, reminiscent of the Cenobite entrance in Hellraiser 2 where their heads are floating around black negative space. The movie by far has the most direct-to-home video feel out of any of the sequels in the franchise. Badly written and acted, weirdly horny, full of contrived reasons to get teenagers into this secret government facility. Every other thing that is said is a one-liner. It repeats the best bits from other better movies, and all around is pretty much what you would expect from a B-movie of this period. It is essentially the story of a man who was brought back to life with an experimental biological serum, which requires him to constantly feast on the brains of the facility workers to continue to live. The main issue here in the first act is that it is desperately trying to be alien, but also isn't giving enough information to be scary. We know that a man is loose in this facility, and that he has been infected with some sort of virus that is keeping him alive, and that he is killing people. But that is all we are told, not who he is or what he looks like or his relation to them, leaving us more frustrated for answers than being fearful of where he is. It is a half-developed setup that stands in the way of enjoying what is actually going on.
Yes, I'm not horror.
Alien teased the design of the creature throughout the film. You saw little hints of what he looked like, but here you really don't get that, which makes the tension that they are trying to build not work. And then when you do see him, he's just a guy. Like you think we're building up to some From Beyond gag where he's got a really exaggerated head because of the title Mind Ripper, but he's just a normal dude. We eventually get that gradual transformation into outright abomination monster territory. But at the start of this, he should have been at least partially already changed. Because all of this build-up for 40 minutes or so, only for it to be a long-haired, ripped 90s man hiding in the air ducts, doesn't really have the effect that I think they were going for here. As harsh as this may all sound, I do like this movie. These cheap, low-effort but fun B-movies made for home video of the 90s and 2000 era are some of my favorites for casual, fun, mindless watching. They harken back in my mind to my Blockbuster video days, and it makes me feel a bit bad to critique them in any way that I normally would, because these just aren't movies that stand up to any kind of criticism at all. It's like that episode of King of the Hill, where Cotton realizes that Bobby's strength and appeal is in his inherent mushiness. The thing with mush is that you can keep stomping on it, but it's all give. It just stays mush. You can't build it up, but you can't break it down either. In a funny way, mush has the edge. I think bad direct-to-video movies are kind of like that when trying to review them. Everyone making this knew what they were making. It was a deliberate style of the time, and still today make up a lot of the best entries on libraries on services like Amazon and Tubi. And these kinds of movies will always hold a special and comfortable place for me. So now it comes to the remake in 2006, and funny enough,
that remake was dog shit.
This movie is also tied into that investment scheme that Craven got his start with back with The Last House on the Left, because the same basic contract was used for both that film and the original Hills Have Eyes, which said that the investors owned the rights to those films for a period of 30 years, at which point the rights would revert back to Craven in perpetuity. And so here in the early 2000s, he found himself in a horror culture that was putting out a great deal of remakes of films that originally came out when he was getting his start, like Dawn of the Dead, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Amityville Horror, Black Christmas, My Bloody Valentine, Carrie, The Fog, The Omen, It's Alive, Prom Night, The Stepfather, When a Stranger Calls, and The Wicker Man. And that's just to name a few. The theme of the decade was shaping up to be defined by trying to recapture that 70s and 80s magic, just this time with more intensity, inspired by other hits of the early half of the decade like Saw, Wolf Creek, and Cabin Fever. And Craven found himself in the unique position around this time of owning the rights completely to two 70s classics that could possibly get remade to capitalize on the current trend. And so that's what he did. And that is largely what separates his Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left remakes from the others of this time. Because this is pretty much the only instance that the original creator was deeply involved in a large capacity, and also was the one who was really financially benefiting from it. In all these other instances, you have people coming in and taking something that they themselves had no prior involvement in, and remaking it because it would be a guaranteed cash generator, based on the name no matter if their remake was good or not. But that's not entirely what these two films were. Craven was very much hands-on involved in the process here. He selected and hired the new writers and directors personally, and gave a guiding hand to oversee the process on these projects to make sure that it was a success by acting as a producer. And in the case of The Hills Have Eyes, Craven decided that Alexander Aja was best suited for the project, after his business partner, Marianne Madalena, told him that he had to watch his 2003 film, High Tension. He would say, "With High Tension, Alex and Gregory demonstrated a multifaceted understanding of what is profoundly terrifying. After viewing the film and then meeting the filmmakers, I knew I wanted to work with them." One thing that I do find interesting is that for both Hills sequels, Craven chose European writers and directors. And obviously, if he felt that these people were the right ones for the job, then they should have gotten it. In any situation, I feel that the person most qualified or the person that just instinctively feels the most right for a certain role should get that position. But I do find it at least interesting to hire someone from France to remake a movie that is this entrenching criticism of American culture. If the situation were reversed and I was offered to make a film with political undertones about a culture that I had never lived in for a great deal of time, then I would not accept that job. But I guess the most basic allegory of Hills can apply to any kind of disparity, and if there's one thing about human nature, it's that economic disparity is universal. So it's not like it's a huge deal, it's just something that catches my eye here. And maybe American culture is so loud and self-described as globally important that it would probably be easy for someone who wasn't from here to still write a satire about it. Craven said on the matter, "I found the best way to go about these is finding someone who is passionate about the original, but wants to make his own picture. Give some guidance at the beginning and then kind of turn them loose." From their perspective, Aja described the process as follows. "Wes was a perfect gentleman and said, 'I already made my movie, and I really respect your vision, so I want you to make your own movie.' Instead, he asked us to find a new approach to the original. I think it was just a week later when we came in with some ideas about working the nuclear testing into the fabric of the story." This is the biggest difference on paper between the two films. It is essentially the exact same plot, with the same basic beats. They actually change shockingly little about the events of the story, with only a new added set piece being the only major difference. But this added thread that goes through the film takes Craven's Hill people and twists them into a group that have become deformed mutants from their exposure to radioactive fallout from the Nevada bomb tests. And that aesthetic informs every decision that they make here. This is first communicated through a great opening credits sequence where we see flashes of the bomb intercut with photographs of those who live in the hills, set to More and More by Webb Pierce, which is another blatant ripoff of the iconic opening of Dawn of the Dead, but I do still love this and miss when it happens in horror movies. I really wish these opening credit sequences would make a comeback, because this gets me every single time. I absolutely loved that Malignant did this last year, and it's just one of the many things that makes me very happy with that film. I think that this is one of the few things that always works every time it's done, and can be a cheap and effective way to flesh out the mythology of a world. But unfortunately with this, they use the nuclear subplot to build a sense of revolt, horror, and disgust based on the outward appearances of people with real-life disabilities, which honestly is extremely disappointing for me and makes the film a whole lot less enjoyable. I think that there's a way that this can be done and also still be fun and mostly harmless. For instance, Toxie in The Toxic Avenger is more or less an original design that is not poking fun at any one type of person in general, that is also based on horror from nuclear exposure. Nobody is walking around looking like Toxie. It is a similar idea to the super mutants from the Fallout series as well. I don't think that anyone has probably ever looked at their designs in those games and felt like that character was supposed to represent them or someone they knew. But the design of each of the mutants in the Hills Have Eyes remake are based on actual genetic disorders that can be experienced by people in real life. Big Brain has hydrocephalus and goiters. Cyst has neurofibromyalgia. Lizard's defining feature is his cleft lip. And Ruby has Goldenhar syndrome. In this way, the Hills Have Eyes remake feels extremely mean-spirited to me. And it didn't have to be. It goes out of its way to do that, and it was a deliberate decision. Lloyd Kaufman's work with Troma films and The Toxic Avenger in general is the exact same type of horror, but is more focused on satirizing and making fun of everyone at a societal level, with a winking eye at the camera. Even though his films are incredibly graphic, and that is what they are known for, he seems like he would be a genuinely kind and nice person in real life, and rarely feels like he is deliberately trying to other a specific type of person, or single anyone out for how they naturally are. He's like the Mel Brooks of horror. I mean, in the year 2000, he wrote a now famous and extremely important open letter in response to the Columbine incident of '99, titled, "Why I Love Gay People," that starts with the lines, "Believe it or not, there are some people out there who, despite having never seen a Troma movie, have drawn some incorrect conclusions about us and our product. They have heard the stories about us, and feel free to roll their eyes heavenward and spew their criticism. Troma is crap. Troma is sexist. Troma panders to the lowest common denominator." This, of course, is coming from someone who never so much as watched a minute of a Troma film run through a projector. These same people would be surprised to learn that Troma is what is called a gay-friendly company. After all, to be gay-friendly means you're enlightened, progressive, caring, and so much other PC horse crap, which Troma is supposedly not known for. But the fact remains, Michael Hertz and I are now, and always have been, very supportive of the gay and lesbian community. And if you go seek this letter out, keep in mind that it was written in 2000, and language has changed significantly since then. It's the intended effect of the letter that is important. And that intent is that just because something is labeled as horror, doesn't mean that it has to exploit real people to be fun. There's a way to express yourself in this style and be as crass or vulgar or intense as you would like to be, like Lloyd Kaufman always was. That is ultimately still about love, even in horror. And I do not get that same vibe from this remake in the slightest. It is mean in an explicit purpose of trying to be as nasty and cruel as possible. And is my least favorite type of horror because it doesn't say anything other than a nihilistic stance, that the world is a horrible place that will eat you alive, and that there's nothing that can be done about it, which is, for the most part, not true. This fear of people who are different has always been with the franchise. I mean, they hired Michael Berryman to play the villain in the original for a reason. His own Wikipedia bio even reads, his unusual physical appearance has allowed Berryman to make a career out of portraying characters in horror movies and B-movies. They visually have always tried to distinguish the Hill people as looking either barbaric or horrific or just different from what you would expect from a quote-unquote normal person living in modern society. But for me, that comes across almost more like a commentary or a parody of how people who do not fit within a certain box are often portrayed within media. It is not embracing that, it is criticizing that. And what was an undertone before here is overt, stripped away from the meaning. What was at the back of our mind before through Aja's lens is made extreme. A clear message that people with disabilities are scary to look at, and if you get too close to them, they will eat you. And I think that that is at its worst by having Pluto be a character in this movie, and have his design be almost a horror movie funhouse mirror reflection of Berryman's real-life condition. And not only that, but they turn his character who was smart and was able to, more than any other character on his side, plan and rationalize situations in the first two films, which made him a good enemy for the family to face off against, into a severely mentally challenged figure who is incapable of speech with super strength who only follows orders. Honestly, if they were going to have Pluto in this, they should have either brought back Berryman to reprise his character, or had the design be wildly different, or just not had the character at all. Because where they went with Pluto in particular, I think, is really gross and reprehensible. And I really hope that he wasn't upset when he saw what they'd done with his work, but I imagine that he probably was. For more on this concept, I would like you to go watch the video Horror Has an Ugliness Problem from the excellent YouTuber Pim's Crypt. Their work is consistently fantastic and they are criminally underrated in my opinion. They are one of my favorite creators on the platform, and I would really love to see their channel get huge soon, because they really deserve it. So please, if you would, go check out their work. You can find the link to that video in the description below. But even with the appearance of the Hill people, which is done for almost complete shock value, there is some legitimate commentary that can be made here if looking at it through a generous lens. The United States government has a long history of taking away the autonomy of the body and removing personal choice by running medical tests or chemical tests on its citizens without knowing all of the possible outcomes. Forced sterilization, forced pregnancies, slavery, and pure negligence to lower class groups that has time and time again led to massive damage to health and loss of life. And as tasteless as it may be, the appearance of these people who have mutated from their exposure to their government's nuclear fallout, which was beyond their own control, is representative of that idea of a callous and uncaring ruling class, ruining the lives of the poor in exchange for knowledge to better reinforce their power. And if we completely ignore the optics of what the physical deformities of these people says on how the filmmakers view people with disabilities, from a pure design aspect, pretty much everything in this movie is done with great execution. The visual effects were handled by K&B, a practical effects house that has been around for decades, who always does amazing work on every project that they get, and the makeup that they provided here is really just on another level. It is really rare to see creature effects that are this upsetting and convincing visually, even in something that has a massive budget, which this did not have. And a lot of the reason for this is that the nuclear-changed mutants were pulled off with a combination of practical makeup effects and slight CGI touch-ups, similar to what was done with the Pirates of the Caribbean films, leading to some really unnerving looks. This movie did not have a massive budget, but what they had, they used it well. This does come with its downsides though, as characters that were quite important in the original films, like Ruby, are only shown in very limited capacity here, because the CGI used on her eyes would have been very expensive to do for a whole runtime, and thus makes her appearances scaled back compared to the original, often being filmed at a distance or from behind or framed with just showing her hands, to cut back on the costs of doing close-ups on her. I do love the decision to give her a red jacket though, not only to tie in with her name, but also to distinguish her from the other mutants, and to make her share characteristics that seem like a halfway point between our main characters and her biological family, without really fitting into either group fully. It is just another example in a Craven film of using clothing to establish the mental headspace of a character. Not only with the character designs, but subtle uses of CGI were used throughout the film to enhance some of the desert surroundings, as well as to create most of the buildings in the town in the ending sequence. And this blend of real and digital imagery is so much more effective and convincing than a lot of stuff today that feels uncanny because there's no foundation in reality for the digital artist to build on top of. This illusion where digital touch-ups are blended into expert levels of makeup creates some shockingly well-done creature designs. And I'll be upfront and say that when I first watched this movie in middle school, it was one of the rare ones that actually quite bothered me at the time. I saw it at my neighbor Jonathan's house soon after it came to DVD, and it felt like something that we weren't supposed to see. It felt excessive in a way that I hadn't really encountered before, and by this point I had watched a great deal of horror. I had seen plenty of things that I would describe as feeling violent before, but nothing really felt this real. After the movie was over, before we went to sleep, Jonathan snuck up behind me to try and scare me by putting his father's shotgun against the side of my head, probably in reference to either the scene in the outhouse or the one at the cliff at the end. I never learned if it was loaded or not, but it was the most angry that I ever was as a kid, and I never went back to his house or spoke to him again after I left the next morning. And I don't think I've ever told anyone that either until this moment, over 15 years later. I knew at the time that if I said something about it, my parents would have killed him, so I just stayed quiet about it. And that's not a condemnation of media. I don't think that movies have a responsibility to not show things that they artistically want to depict, just because some dumb kids may go try it at home. But I do think that Jonathan's dad should have locked his gun case and kept his son out of it. Weirdly, all this time later, that moment is the main thing that I've been able to associate with The Hills Have Eyes for my entire life. I like some of the character work that was put into this, especially with the decision to age down Bobby to appear as if he's maybe 16 or so. You can tell that these are supposed to be the same characters, but they no longer have a distinctive sense of personal style, now more just resembling average everyday mid-2000s Americans, which is a decision unto itself. Bobby even has that long-sleeve thermal under the t-shirt thing, and what is lost in style is gained in relatability. This is your average conservative American family on display, as represented in the year 2006. And speaking of the mid-2000s, the script and tone for this is plagued by the stylings of pop horror of the era, where everyone is excessively mean to each other, even before the horror itself enters their lives. I hate this artificial tension. This is my least favorite genre decade, and part of that is that nobody actually acts like real people. Everyone is selfish and brutish. I mean, there are some people out there who are just mean-spirited and aggressive, this is true. But certainly not every single person on the planet. And a lot of the work that comes from this time period feels like they are from the perspective of someone who feels like every person that they have ever met has wronged them in some way, and I don't enjoy watching a lot of the output that uses this tone. Another major difference here that added to this is that the film is excessively violent, even for that period of time. Some would even say gratuitously so. It is obsessed with the physical aspect of this clash in ideology and the fragility of life, without actually commenting on it in any meaningful way. Which makes sense considering that this was their first American film after coming out of the new French extremity cinematic movement. It has a clinical obsession with violence, the body, and gross imagery. A focus on the suffering itself and not about overcoming that or what that suffering means in relation to the person who is experiencing it. And stuff like this, along with Saw and other films of that nature, changed the way that people talk about horror for a good while, and I don't think in a good way. You can look all around and see that it still has its residual effects in our culture. Horror isn't just about violence. Violence is a stylistic way to get across ideas. It is a medium to convey messages. But since these movements of extremity, you see more of a rise of true crime, and people who obsess over how many kills are in a horror movie and how graphic they are, rather than what the movie is actually about on an emotional level and what they're trying to convey to their audience. And that has always been a thing within the genre, and maybe it is just the internet making it feel bigger than it actually is. But I get the feeling that it is more prominent with some subsects than it once was. All in all, the 2006 iteration of this universe is a technical achievement that is leaps and bounds above the original in that department. Story-wise, they are essentially the exact same in terms of plot. The first leans more into that social commentary, but both work in their own way. The remake is much more focused on the visceral horror than actually saying anything with its message, which isn't an outright bad thing, but leaves certain things feeling odd, such as Papa Jupiter, who was the driving force of rage, bloodlust, and revenge in the first film, who in this one is reduced to only being on screen for maybe a minute. His explosive death at the end only has impact if you remember the first movie that it is calling back to, and without the context of that ending, it all feels strange. It is big, it is bombastic, but it is spent on a character that we have no connection to, a character that we just met. But all in all, I do feel as if this is pretty much the best remake that we could have hoped for out of this era of horror, and was followed up with a direct sequel the next year, The Hills Have Eyes 2, which was actually written by Wes Craven, along with his son Jonathan. This is one of those rare movies like Texas Chainsaw 3 that is known for having a concept trailer that ended up being way better than the movie itself. Which, if you've not seen the insane first teaser for Texas Chainsaw 3, after finishing this you really should go watch Leatherface essentially be anointed by divine right to kill people, by mystically having his chainsaw bestowed upon him by the Lady of the Lake, which is then powered by a lightning strike from the heavens. For this movie, it is just one static shot of the desert as a mutant steps into frame dragging a body behind him to take home and devour, before the camera starts to move and we realize that we are seeing things from the perspective of a second body that is also being dragged. It is such a simple trailer, but it works so well. I want to talk more about this at a later date, but I kind of wish that all movie trailers were just like this. Just tone pieces that didn't actually contain any real footage from the actual movie itself. People would say that this wouldn't work, but video games have been getting away with it for decades, and people still eat this kind of thing up whenever it happens. I would love to see a movie come out with just having 3 tone pieces as their trailers, without ever showing a single frame from the actual movie. I think people would go crazy for this kind of thing, or at least talk about it a lot online. If you thought the remake was about pain and the nastiness of modern horror, the sequel really is where it fully embraces that mindset. We literally start with the frame of the face of a screaming woman who is tied to the bed in slow motion, so that you can get a good look at the complex contortions of the flesh when experiencing near-death fear. This whole movie really doubles down on what the first one started, and also isn't a very fun watch for me. There's a forced breeding subplot in this that I think is particularly bad, where they're using women to farm babies for meat, which could have possibly been used as a commentary on the meat industry, but is hardly touched on beyond simple shock purposes. As much as Craven talked about regretting how extreme The Last House on the Left was with this type of content, he sure enjoyed revisiting those ideas in the 2000s. One of my main problems with this film is that it came out 1 year and 13 days after the first one, which is admirable. It's a very 80s mindset, which I do actually somewhat like. But if we're being realistic here, 1 year is not enough turnaround time to actually do something on this scale well, and the cracks are all over this thing. Both movies had the same budget of $15 million, but watching them back to back, you would probably guess that this cost at least half of what the first one did, because they didn't have the time available to apply that money in effective ways. It is a demonstration of that good, fast, and cheap Venn diagram, where the remake was good and cheap, but its sequel was fast and cheap. This just lacks any sense whatsoever. The first time anyone sees a mutant, he is found just standing in the middle of nowhere, eating raw intestines with his bare hands and covered in blood, right after one of their friends goes missing. And our protagonist of the scene literally just walks up to him and says, "Hi, are you lost? My name is Dr. Foster. Do you have a name?" And then, as you would assume, he promptly gets killed. And this is just not how anyone would handle this situation. I mean, he is an investigator who has been hired to investigate the story that rednecks might have killed and eaten a whole family of people in this area. And he's just walking around like he was sent to get them to answer their census forms. Then this guy goes and looks for him, and not even a minute after the first guy gets killed, he gets snuck up on and stabbed with a spear. And in any kind of rocky terrain like this with loose dirt, where any sound travels far, it would be pretty much impossible to actually sneak up on anyone like this, especially someone with high-level military training. These guys are the special forces who have been sent in to find out what really happened to the Carter family and clear this area out. And I'm not meaning to nitpick, I'm just trying to show that to enjoy this entry in any capacity, you really have to turn your brain off and not think about what you're seeing. This movie is essentially one of those unfortunate mid-2000s pieces, where good artists tried to make meaningful commentary on 9/11 and the situation in the Middle East. And that is the job of the artist to some degree, to comment on current social issues. But mixing soldiers into The Hills Have Eyes and then saying, look, it's just like the Middle East, isn't necessarily the statement that they thought it was. Maybe it's just me, but this kind of action horror sequel has only worked like twice with Aliens and Terminator 2, and then never really has again. Having men in military uniforms yelling at each other and being mean for an hour and a half is not character writing. And I'm not really trying to give Craven a hard time with this. There was a weird psychological thing in the air for about 10 years or so, where everybody had to make a deep, complex statement on the military and the United States and war and 9/11. And pretty much all of them have aged really poorly, and I bet that most people who made this kind of dramatic war art probably regret it now or feel a little embarrassed about it. And just looking at it from a horror cinema perspective, horror really only works and thrives if there's a sense of vulnerability. And so sending a bunch of 30-year-old armed trained men in to wipe these people out, who were already severely wronged by their government, makes us root for the hill people even more and not fear them. But maybe this was the point? But having their designs so extreme in concept makes that difficult as well. The movie is saying at the same time that these people are gross and that you should fear them, and also that you should feel bad for them, and that they are victims of systematic abuse by their government. Those two ideas do not work in conjunction with each other. It is a convoluted mess of mixed messaging, done in such a way as to suggest that the filmmakers themselves didn't really know what they wanted to say here. They constantly are trying to frame it like the military men are very afraid of what's going on, but it comes across as just so false, when they each are walking around with massive machine guns, and are fighting practically unarmed people who can hardly defend themselves. But again, that might have been the point that they were going for. They might have been trying to make some legitimate commentary on the nature of American soldiers blowing innocent people away in these conflicts. The prologue of the film is a flashback to one of their missions in the Middle East, where they detonate an explosive, and then have to listen as a mother wails in the background in agony, because they had just killed her child. But, in order for that to work as commentary, I think the hill people also have to be humanized. And this is by far the worst entry in the Hills Have Eyes franchise for that. By this point, these people no longer even have personalities. They are just raping mindless ghouls. They don't even want revenge, they just want meat. They are stripped of any decency, and presented as only their most basic animalistic selves. They should have honestly scrapped their original concept and started over with a new idea. Because when they started working on this, they wanted to focus on Brenda from the first movie, and see her joining the military to get over her fears and trauma from those events, only in turn for her first mission to be sent into that same desert where her family was killed. And it would have been presented like the second act of a revenge film, and I think that's a pretty cool idea, and I think it would have worked well. But by this point, Emily DeRaven was playing Claire on Lost, and wouldn't be available for a sequel, leaving all of the military stuff in here having absolutely no meaning for any character present. But since this film had to be out in 1 year and the script was written in just a couple of weeks, and they were already prepping to shoot a military story, there wasn't really any time to switch gears. Really, everything present here, and from most sequels that get this little time in development, fall apart in that desire to strike while the iron is hot. Frequently, it is just better to wait to reheat the iron. This does exactly what you think it will based on the premise. Military dudes start getting picked off, even though they are the ones with the clear upper hand in this situation. Mutants start coming out of the hills who have way less care in their designs than the previous entry, because there was no time to do big makeup jobs for this. Which is probably also why this movie is so dark and filmed primarily in tunnels, so you won't notice how weak their designs are. They start to fight and our heroes narrowly win and save the day, escaping with their lives. The movie is just so poorly written that it doesn't even have an ending scene, just text on the screen to tell you what the ending is. It is the exact same formula presented here for the fourth time in the same setting, and unfortunately, by this point it comes across as extremely stale and does absolutely nothing new with the material. And with this, The Hills Have Eyes died with a fizzle, making half of its predecessor at the box office with a pretty terrible critic and audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. This clicked with very few people, and now practically nobody talks about The Hills Have Eyes as a franchise. 15 or so years later, it seems dead in the water, and I think that is probably a good thing. It was never an idea that should have been turned into a big spanning franchise. It is a commentary that works one time, and isn't an idea that is super malleable to have it branch out into other territories. For a franchise to work, it really has to be open enough to where other teams of people can take the concept and run with it. But here there really isn't a way to do that without breaking the concept entirely. But that's not a bad thing. Not everything should be milked for every dollar that it can produce. Sometimes having made a single good movie is a good and admirable thing. And the original still stands as an important work in horror history, both for what it says and also how it stabilized Craven's career. Without it, there would be no Nightmare on Elm Street. There would be no Scream. Not everything needs to go on forever and be continued over and over again. It could, and probably should have, remained this interesting remnant from the 70s that made a commentary on some topical events going on in the world, where today we could look back on it and see far out in the unmapped desert, beyond the towns and roads, that the hills still have eyes.
More and more, I'm forgetting the past. More and more, I'm living at last. Day by day, I'm losing my blues. More and more, I'm forgetting about you. But oh, how I try to keep you by my side. And oh, how I cry the day you say goodbye. Day by day, I'm losing my blues. More and more, I'm forgetting about you.
You think? Elections.
Fear them. But maybe this was the point? But having their designs so extreme in concept makes that difficult as well. The movie is saying at the same time that these people are gross and that you should fear them, and also that you should feel bad for them, and that they are
It's right here.
fearing that one of the primary inspirations for Craven here was Tobe Hooper's 1974 masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And
All in all, for that period where I very clearly was fucking unconscious because of my exhaustion and tiredness from coming back from the other place, what did we learn about the true heart of the mindset of this character? What did we learn? What did we learn as people about InPraiseOfShadows? Because I fail to be captured by what exactly makes him special. I mean, I literally fell asleep in this man. That's fucking unfortunate. Anywho. Well, that's VSChat. I have no else to say. InPraiseOfShadows literally is a fucking snore that puts me in fucking sleep. It's crazy. Anywho. I clearly need to take a nap and I'll be back. Fucking Christ almighty.
some would even go so far to say that this is a ripoff of Chainsaw.